I hope you've enjoyed today's content in the New Future of Work track at the Microsoft Research Summit. I know I certainly have. Thank you very much for joining us, and thanks in particular for engaging in the conversation in the chat. Now it's time for us to foreground some of that conversation and answer some of the questions that you've raised in the live video feed as well. So I'm going to be back again with Shamsi, Iqbal, and Longqi Yang, who pulled together all of the presentations that you saw today. And we've also invited two leaders from Microsoft's New Future of Work initiative, Brent Hecht and Sonia Jaffe, to join us in answering your questions. Brent is the Director of Applied Science here at Microsoft and a tenured professor at Northwestern. He's well known for the research that he's done in human-centered AI, but of particular relevance to today's conversation is that he's one of the few people in the world who has an advanced degree in both computer science and geography. Sonia is an economist at Microsoft's Office of the Chief Economist, and she has a PhD in economics from Harvard University and did a postdoc at the University of Chicago. And she's bringing expertise in industrial organizations and labor economics to the conversation. She's also used causal analysis to help us tease out some of the impact of the move to remote work from the impact of working in the middle of a pandemic. And so the set of us are going to be available now to talk about some of the topics that have come today. And we're going to start by pulling some of the questions that have come up throughout the presentations, but we're also going to address any of the questions that you put in the chat now, so please participate. I'm going to be moderating and directing those questions then to the experts who are in this virtual room. But I thought we would get started by just doing a quick round robin answer of a question just to get us all speaking. And so Brent, Longqi, Sonia, and Shamsi, I want to know, what kind of meeting do you think is best now that you've got experience with remote meetings and in-person meetings and hybrid meetings? Which meeting type would you most want to attend? Longqi, why don't we start with you?
Well, thanks, Jamie. Well, this is a very hard question, actually, and I'm actually reflecting this question while you're asking. So I think my favorite meetings so far are the meetings that we host remotely that actually pulling people across different organizations that were otherwise not possible before the pandemic. So I think during the remote work vaccine, we were able to actually pull in people from many different fields, many different organizations to work together, to meet together, and really address that geographic and also time zone boundaries.
Awesome. What about you, Brent? What's your favorite kind of meeting?
I have to be annoying and say it depends. One thing we've learned is that, now that we have a lot more meeting types, the problem is not so much, choosing one meeting type for all purposes. It's choosing the right meeting type for the specific purpose that you have. So, for instance, one thing that brings me a great deal of joy and happiness is being able to meet in person with my team occasionally, but that's not going to be, something in person, excuse me. But we don't need to do that all the time in person, right? We can have more regular check-ins, remotely, these types of things.
What about you, Sonia? What's your favorite kind of meeting?
Well, seconding Longqi and Brent on the caveats, but I really miss in-person, particularly in-person walking meetings with my teammates.
Yeah, walking meetings when you're doing it on your own aren't the same, right? Like if I'm just carrying my phone, it doesn't have the same. All right, Shamsi, what about you?
Oh, now I have to provide a different answer. No, really, honestly, I really like remote meetings for just one reason. I find it often difficult to kind of participate in a conversation. And so the chat features that we have, that's amazing. That makes my voice heard. But I would also say that after watching the hybrid meetings discussion today, I can see what the promise could be, and I'm really, really excited.
Yeah, that was amazing. Good. So, Brent, you gave a fairly broad answer, but you've got a real deep knowledge of the geography of work. Is there anything that you can take from the geography of work and use to inform your answer?
meetings. Oh boy, yes, of course. And one thing I love about geography is it is a field that encourages you to think about all relationships between people and places, not just the relationships of a specific type. So I think, let's see, what's something that would be particularly interesting for folks to chew on? Here's one. So one thing that having occasional meetings in the office affords is the ability to have the same amount of commute time, but live further away. So one hypothesis people have is that we might see more folks when they engage in acts of residential preference, like renting an apartment or buying a house, they might choose to live further out. So for instance, here in the Seattle area, they might even live beyond the mountains in a place like Yakima, or further up the Hudson River Valley in New York, because they can come in for those in-person meetings 1 or 2 days a week.
Thanks. And Sonia, I was wondering if we could tap into a little bit of your insight into what sort of changes we're seeing as a function of the pandemic versus as a function of remote work, and how that might apply to the kinds of meetings or the kinds of collaborative engagements that people have more generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of feelings of disconnect from people, and also a lot of feelings that we were spending way too much time on screens. And I think that both of those things are somewhat affected or somewhat driven by remote work, but that it's really important to remember that, like, during lockdowns, right, people were feeling disconnected, but they also weren't going out in the evenings to see their friends or seeing their neighbors. They were much more isolated outside of work. And so those feelings of disconnect were only partially due to the working remotely. And so going forward, and as things have started to open up in many places, it's not just remote work that affects kind of how people are feeling connected. And also, I think the Zoom fatigue, right? I was doing most of my social interactions with friends on Zoom. And so that it all accumulates in terms of how much screen time, how tired people are of staring at boxes of other people.
Yeah, no, and actually following up on that, Shamsi, I know you've got a lot of kind of in-depth knowledge into well-being and multitasking and a lot of these sorts of things that are making all of this online engagement particularly challenging. I wonder if you can speak to some of the things that are causing fatigue with online meetings or our kind of remote engagements more generally.
Yeah, I was just having this discussion with someone else the other day, and I think that one of the reasons why online meetings can be so exhausting is that it is so cognitively loading. We are processing so much more. I mean, when you are in person, you are looking, I mean, there are all these subtle cues in the environment that you automatically pick up on, so it's like habitually processed. But when you are looking at a screen online, you have to put in that extra effort. And that's just about processing the meeting itself. There's a meeting chat going on. There's so much information that's being shared. I think that's just putting a load on how we process and integrate information. And it's kind of like we feel that we are on all the time. And that's particularly why it's so important that we insert breaks and these physical activities into our days so that we are able to take care of ourselves.
Yeah. Something that you mentioned, Shamsi, sort of in your initial answer.
Did we lose?
Like we lost Jamie, I can take over just because there's a background chat. Background chat that I have a sense of where she was headed. So folks have some questions about how the shift to remote work has affected different people differently, specifically across different demographic groups, whether it be gender or ability, these types of things. I was wondering if you could reflect more on that.
So is this a question for me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that there was also so much that came up in the discussions today. For example, I think it was the Equitable Futures and the Thriving Organizations discussion where the panelists talked about how the pandemic has affected different people differently. So there's people, especially women and women with children, they are leaving the workforce. There are people with different abilities who are finding it difficult need to be really, really observant and careful when we are going back to hybrid so that we don't leave these people behind. So it's kind of like thinking about, I mean, these things were always there, but I think that in the last 18 months, all of these issues came to the forefront. And as Ed Doran, he mentioned in the Thriving Organizations panel, is that we don't want to go back to the old normal. We want to go to a better future now that we have all this knowledge with us.
Yeah, and I think another thing to think about there is kind of the effect, and then also, so what we see, for example, that women have been more affected by layoffs during the pandemic, but we also have, they've seen in some LinkedIn data that women are more likely to apply for remote jobs. So on the one hand, maybe they're more negatively affected, but they're also presented with more opportunities. And if we think about it from like an organizational perspective, you don't want to have hybrid work policies that create differential effects within your current population, but you also have to think how it's going to affect who you hire and who your population of employees is. So there's both this like what economists would call the external margin of like who's coming in and out, and then the internal margin of like within the people who are the intensive margin within the people who are there.
And then Longqi, I was wondering if you might want to think of, share a bit about, the ways that software might be replacing space as a technology, and ideas that have been mentioned in the literature on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is one of the things that I think on top of people's mind a lot these days, because like in the remote environment, we lose all the in-person connections and in-person interactions, which we use to kind of build relationships between people. So like as we are moving to remote or hybrid environment, then I think the question really is how can we use software to complement some of the connections or interactions that we miss. So that includes, the collaboration software that we use and the content that we see that are recommended by these different products and different platforms in a way that not just make people engage more, but really help them achieve their goals. And also, at the organizational level, how can we help organizations to achieve their goals through these new kind of virtual environment where software sort of mediate all the interactions and communications between people.
So I think another question that we get a whole bunch is about how we can make sure that folks who are remote and maybe not come into the office as often, don't feel like they're second-class citizens and these types of things. Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a concern and a challenge a lot of remote workers faced prior to the pandemic. I think for people who were already remote, the universal or widespread remote work has been a boon in terms of them not being the only remote person in the room. And so I think that we're definitely trying to do some research around what practices feel most inclusive to remote attendees. I think that a big piece of it is just for the in-person people to be really intentional about inclusion. And when they ask a question, make sure they're soliciting input and opinions from remote attendees, because it's very easy for the people in the room to kind of just get into a discussion, and it can be harder for remote attendees to jump in. There's also a recommendation to have kind of a moderator, particularly if you're in a medium that has a parallel chat, making sure that someone in the room is tasked with, rather than just saying, oh, everyone should be intentional about pulling those people in, have a specific person whose job it is, and they can make sure they're following the chat and directing attention to remote people as necessary.
I think that's great. One thing we're thinking a lot about, right, is not trying to make the remote and in-person experience the exact same, right, but instead to lean into the strengths and the weaknesses of each of those modalities, right? So what are some of the advantages that you have when you're remote, and how can we lean into that? What are some advantages that you have in person, and how can we lead into that? And actually, speaking of advantages when remote, I see we have a question here about people extending their days, right? So we see in our log data, people who used to log in around 8:30, maybe are logging in now around 7 and logging off around 7 p.m. instead of 5. And I know, Shamsi, you know a lot about the contours that are happening, behind the scenes of behind the scenes of those log observations. So I was wondering if you might be willing to share there.
Yeah, there's this discussion around a third peak now emerging. And so in fact, Mary Sherinsky and her Hugh team found some data recently this summer where there's a little peak that is emerging after hours. So, I mean, many years ago, we looked at how there were like two main productivity peaks during the day, and this third peak is corresponding to people working after hours. And these are less about collaboration. These are mostly people working on their own. So this basically suggests two things. One is that as people's lives are now interleaved, they have like their personal life interleaved with their work life, their days are now extending. The other thing that touches upon flexibility as well a little bit is that now that we are learning more to be more inclusive and collaborating more with our remote participants, now we are working across time zones, which means that, well, now previously when my colleague from China had to kind of like adapt to the Pacific time zone to get in a meeting. Now we are much more open to actually logging in at 8 o'clock at night so that they are able to participate in a meeting at a suitable time for them. So I think that we'll see these patterns, and now how can we make sure that these are not becoming another replacement for a longer workday? I think that we need to work actively towards those.
Shamsi, you and I both have young kids, so that third peak definitely is beneficial after they go to bed. That's been a secret to my success over the last little bit.
You have a much younger kid than I do, but yes absolutely.
Just learning how to do remote work and be a working parent at the same time.
And to jump in there, I think it's really important that teams discuss that and set expectations, and so that it's not one person's like flexibility becoming another person's unwanted after hours messaging, right? It's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to have dinner with my kids and then go back for a meeting, or I'm going to take a walk in the afternoon and do some work, either maybe a 7 a.m. meeting or 7 p.m., things like that. But it's another to have this feeling that you're always on because someone from another time zone might message you and you're expected to respond. So having those conversations as a team and with various collaborators about when you're available, what expected response times are, or just getting everyone on the same page about expectations and finding collaboration patterns that works for the individual and then also for the team. Oh, Jaime, we're not hearing you.
Anyone know lip reading?
No, one thing I can add on to what Sonia was saying is one thing we talk about a lot when we're talking to policy people in the company and in our when we have customer conversations as well is thinking about when we do spend time in the office, we can think about those as shared hours versus as shared days. So, for instance, Longqi and I are on the same team, and we've decided that we're going to all make sure when on days we're going to be in the office, we're going to be in the office from 10 to 3. Instead of from the 9 to 5, and what that really that does something very important, and that allows us to commute during off-peak hours, which can dramatically reduce commute times, which we see in the data as the far and away number one thing people most value from work from home. So that's another way we can take advantage of flexibility.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Good. The joys of working from home, right? This is I was actually really struck with the conversation around how the kind of temporal patterns of the workday have changed at home. I'm curious if you found temporal patterns changing in the office as well. Are you still working the same hours in the office, or is that changing?
I think the large scale data is still waiting to be seen about like what patterns will emerge. But personally, just as Brent mentioned, I think my commute to office is definitely dramatically changed. And for example, our team has agreed to just stay in office from 10 to 3 instead of the full day. And also we choose which days to go to the office. So I think there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be looked at from the data.
Yeah. Is there a sweet spot in how often people should go in into the office? I know there was a question earlier in the chat today about how often orgs should have meeting-free days. Is that a weekly thing or a monthly thing?
So I can quickly jump in there. One thing we have, just as an initial best practice, right? Because this is just commenting earlier in meeting states. So in terms of our everyday lives, probably the most uncertainty we've seen for most of us in our lifetimes, right? So we don't know for sure how things are going to unfold, but as an initial research-backed starting point, 3 days a week, 5 hours a day seems pretty good. There might be other pretty good options too, but the data does suggest that if you're in 3 days a week, you sort of get most of the benefits of in-person work, and you also get those two days of flexibility. And then 5 hours should be good enough to get those benefits and also miss out on the commute times for the rough commute.
And in terms of the meetings, I know some orgs of Microsoft have been trying to do a once a week meeting day, but there's I think a bit of a feeling that just kind of makes the adjacent days all the more hectic. And I have heard from the groups that have tried doing, I think, once a month, that feels more like a real break, because rather than just moving your regular once a week meeting, that like maybe it gets canceled instead of just moved to a different day if the no meeting day happens once a month.
So I wanted to interject with one point here. And this is somewhat related, but not exactly research that was in the space. And so about 12 years ago or more, Gloria Marx showed in her work where when people tend to get interrupted or they self-interrupt themselves, and when they come back, they're more efficient with the time that they actually have available to do their primary task. So my intuition here is that people will learn how to adapt. If they have a meeting-free day, they will tend to focus more on those days, though I agree with Sonia that the other days will now be clamped with meetings. But I think that there is definitely a growing need to be able to focus more, and having that day that can be dedicated to focus, I think that's super important.
Yeah, and then I see there's a question that I think, Brent, is going to be really relevant to you and your expertise in terms of space. How does remote work impact the corporate thinking associated with the capital costs of owning and managing low-occupied facilities?
Really good question. The first point to remember when thinking about this question is that the geography has a long memory. It's one of my favorite quotes about geography. So decisions about space generally unfold over much longer time periods than decisions, about other topics. So this is definitely something that's top of mind for folks who maybe signed a lease in 2018 for 20 years on some corporate real estate, are kind of wondering what they might want to do with it. Let's get to the actual data. So we see most of the survey data associated with coming from decision makers, folks who make real estate decisions at companies, does suggest that they're interested in reducing their footprint, not by 80%, but one survey was around 15, one put out by McKinsey was about 30%. One really interesting problem with that, though, is that the best way to do hybrid is to make sure that collaborators are in the office together on the same days. And that's kind of a paradox with or at least at tension with the desire to reduce a real estate footprint. So in sort of a default case, you could imagine like a big building being super occupied Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then being basically ghost towns Monday and Friday, like they are right now, Saturday and Sunday. So sort of shift into a majority ghost town. One solution to that, though, is intelligence. So AI and machine learning combined with sensor data can do a wonderful job sort of squeezing a lot more value out of the space we have, out of a smaller amount of space. So you could recommend that teams meet in specific places on specific days. You can make sure that those teams have reservations as they need, these types of things. So it becomes, quite frankly, it's where space was less of an optimization problem now, it's really like a classic computer science optimization problem. And that means that computer science can play a role in solving it.
Thanks. We have another question in the chat. This one, I think, Sonia, you'll have good thoughts on. The question is, about the traditional 5-day work week. And actually it wrapped up not in the way I was expecting. It was sort of saying, why are we still talking about the traditional 5-day work week? And I was thinking of all the conversation around 4-day work weeks. But it actually asks, why would work not now extend over 7 days?
Yeah, and I absolutely think that the two are related. I think that part of the flexibility that we think is an important piece of the benefits of hybrid work will involve people being able to work on any of the 7 days that works well for them. But similar to the coordination and the conversations that I mentioned earlier, a lot of work is best done at the same time that your colleagues are working. And so in some ways, our 5-day work week is a coordination device. I want to be working on the same days that my teammates are working so that when I have a question, I can ping them. And kind of the default Monday through Friday is an easy coordination device. If you want to move away from that one, you can, but you've got to replace it with other good coordination systems. And the fact that people tend to have parties on the weekend, and there's societal level coordination as well in terms of my wanting to have free time when my friends also have free time. So I do think we will see a little bit more of work bleeding and people going to a doctor's appointment on Friday and catching up on work on Saturday. But I don't think we're going to completely move away from having designated days as weekends.
Thanks, Sonia. That was great answer. And unfortunately, that's all that we have time for. So thank you, Shamsi, Longqi, Sonia, and Brent for joining us in this Q&A. And thanks to all of you for attending the sessions as part of the New Future of Work track at the Microsoft Research Summit. As we've been talking about, we've pretty much all by necessity become experts in remote work this past year. But hopefully today you've learned a little bit about how work has changed and where work is going, as well as some tricks that might help you be more productive in the future. Of course, despite the decades of research into remote and hybrid work by the academic community and by folks here at Microsoft Research, and despite a year and a half of research that we've been doing into what it was like to work during the pandemic in particular, it's still almost impossible to predict what work is going to look like a month from now, even let alone a few years from now. But it's important to remember that our job isn't actually to predict the future of work, it's to help shape it. We're creating that future, and we're in the middle of one of the greatest disruptions to work in generations, and we collectively have an opportunity to reimagine work for the better. So research into the future of work is evolving quickly. We're figuring this out as we go along. Stay current on the latest progress at the Microsoft Research New Future of Work site, which is located at aka.ms/New Future of Work. And we hope to see you at another Microsoft Research event soon. Thank you.